Hello, class. Welcome back. Today we're beginning with Karl Marx. We left off last week with Rousseau, and almost 100 years have passed since, and Marx is writing in the 19th century. In the 1840s, the bulk of the work we're going to read are his so-called early works that he wrote before he was 30. And a lot has changed in Europe during this time. In this 1 century, many events have happened. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, beginning in England, there is the gradual industrialization of the world, the Industrial Revolution, and also globally, major ramifications through colonialism, right? What has happened in this transition in a kind of schematic way is the establishment and creation, the beginning of taking shape of the new kind of society, which we call modern society. The modern society exists in contradistinction to the old kind of society, also called the old regime or feudalism. And the old society is characterized by an absolute monarchy, one monarch, king, who rules over a territory. This is a kind of Hobbesian picture, who rules on the basis of a divine right of kings, claims that all kings or monarchs are legitimate because they have been ordained by God to have control over a particular region and have subjects. The territory itself is divided into large landed estates. These are in turn owned by a bunch of lords and feudal lords and aristocratic lords who have their own militias and armies, right? Who have their own knights, who have their own vassals. And they all command an army of peasants, serfs who are tied to that land, who are bound to that land, and who do cultivation on that land. The peasants do bulk of the production, and the feudal lords live off of that, right? If you ever watched Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones gives you actually a very good sociological account of feudal society. From this kind of structure of society, with the beginnings of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance, there are questions about what might it actually mean to live in a society of human freedom. And that begins to, in some sense, concretize with the transitions to modernity, with the American and the French Revolution especially. The establishment of liberal constitutional republics and the beginnings of commercial society, what we call today capitalism, right? Where individuals are all allowed to have their own property, their rights are protected by the state, they can pursue their narrow private interests in civil society, and they have a state which grants them all kinds of rights. They might even have citizenship if they're propertied men. They can vote, they can elect, and the state rules through their consent, right? So it's a kind of Lockean picture, let's say. So that's the modern society that we're living in, even today in some ways. But it's really beginning to take shape in the 18th, 19th century when Marx is writing. And Marx will adopt a kind of critical attitude towards this transformation. He will say that this transition, although it does represent a certain kind of progress and achievement in the sense that you're no longer bound by the shackles of feudalism, but this progress is still nonetheless not really what human freedom is. Okay? That he takes, in a Rousseauian fashion, a kind of critical attitude towards the progress that has been made. And again, he will try to show that actually it still involves, this new kind of society still involves many forms of domination and human unfreedom. Okay? And his whole political project, his whole intellectual project, is therefore committed to trying to establish the grounds and the conditions of possibility for genuine human freedom. Recall again the distinction I drew between positive and negative liberty, borrowing Isaiah Berlin. I reformulated that as freedom and autonomy, right? So Marx wants to understand the conditions of possibility for autonomy, that human beings live together in a society where they construct the rules and conditions of their life, right? In a way that they are conscious of. So today I'm going to give you an overall picture of Marx, because we're only reading the early works, and we're reading only a few pages, which are written in kind of dense philosophical style, and it's difficult to interpret. So I'll try to contextualize them within the broader intellectual framework of Marx. But almost everything I say about Marx, I have to caveat it and say that every claim I make is going to be subject to controversy and contestation. This is probably true for all thinkers, but especially true for Marx, that almost everything he's written has led to some kind of conflict over interpretation. Marxism or Marx's works became, in many ways, the ideological basis for a world religion, namely communism, which shaped the regimes of the Soviet Union and Communist China. Whether or not Marx would actually endorse them is not to me a controversial issue, because I think Marx would have been quite horrified by them if you really understand Marx. But nonetheless, people were willing to kill each other over interpretations of Marx and even identification with Marxism. So almost everything you say about Marx is going to always be subject to some kind of contestation and controversy. That being said, I'm going to offer you my interpretation, which I think is correct based on the texts. But point being, you should take it with a grain of salt. But today we're reading only the early works, and even tomorrow we're going to read mostly the Manifesto and the German Ideology. These are all works that he wrote before 1848, 1850. Many people claim that there is a radical transformation in Marx's whole intellectual orientation, that the later works represent a different kind of Marx. The later works include typically Das Kapital, his magnum opus in a way. I don't agree with these characterizations. I believe that, in fact, there is an immense continuity in Marx's work. And the only reason why one would want to read the early works is really because it is here that he's laying out his grand grand intellectual project, and the thrust of his whole inquiry that is rooted in concerns over human freedom and emancipation. Without understanding these, we cannot really make sense of the later works. The later works are actually much more narrow in their focus. Das Kapital is simply an analysis of the capitalist economy. And Marx, in fact, never actually fulfilled or finished his whole ambitious intellectual project. He wanted to write a critique of political economy, of which Capital was supposed to only be the first part. Capital Volume 1 was the first pamphlet of the first part. He only published Capital Volume 1. Volume 2, Volume 3, and then a fourth volume called The Theories of Surplus Value were all compiled by Engels, who was still around, along with some Marxists. And then Marx was supposed to move on to a critique of finance, then to a critique of law, to state, critique of international affairs. So he had this immense intellectual project, many volumes, and he didn't even finish the first pamphlet of the first part, right? So there's a radical incompleteness in his whole intellectual work. And this often leads to these kinds of simplistic characterizations of a rupture in Marxist thought, that the later works are of a different character. It's different only when you understand that Marx is actually trying to address something much more specific, and the scope of the later works are more narrow in there. If you want to get a sense of its overall picture, then it's really, you have to read through the early works. And more importantly, for the purpose of this course, his political philosophy really comes alive only in the early works. So that's what we're going to try to do, but it would require me to pull together and give you a sense of the comprehensive picture. So that's this lecture is going to be a little bit long for that purpose. I'm trying to give you both a kind of Marxist view of the world, his broader social theory, social and political theory, and then we're going to go and read the text systematically in order to unpack their meaning. So let me begin then with a few words on Marx. Notice, I'm sure you would have noticed that Marx uses the word critique a lot, right? Das Kapital, his magnum opus, has the subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy. Tomorrow we will read 2 pages from a contribution to the critique of political economy, which is a work that he had written before he had published Das Kapital. Today we read pages from a contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and the second reading on the Jewish question. There is a part at which Marx says, just at the critical moment, Bauer's criticism ceases to be critical. So there is a fascination with this word critique. That is because Marx intends his theory to be a critical theory. That is, he develops his own thought only through the criticism of other theorists' work. Right? But through the criticism of other theorists' work, he's able to formulate a critique of institutions and society and history. Okay. Now, theory, to do critical theory, doesn't mean that you're gonna simply criticize something and reject it. Right? So the nature of his critique is not to begin with a set of abstract moral criteria, external abstract moral criteria, and say, well, I don't like this and I don't like that. He does what we can call an immanent critique. That is, he doesn't ask the question, well, why are things not some other way? This is simply how things should be, but they are not the way they are. So hence, we should reject the way the things are. We should reject the way that the things are. His point is in doing critical theory, we're actually asking fundamental questions. We're asking the question, why are things the way they are? Okay. And only when we pose that question, this will force us to confront the inner logics of the things and understand and comprehend and grasp their contradictions. Okay, it is only when you confront, try to examine the things as they are, that you'll be able to get a sense of what their limitations are and what their contradictions are. And once you grasp that, it can show you, open the doors and avenues to think about how things might be different. Okay, how you might be able to transcend things as they are and move on to something higher and better. Higher and better in the sense that you're able to eliminate the contradictions that plague things as they are, and then absorb what is good, and then move on to a higher stage. This is called Aufhebung. This is the German, the Hegelian notion of Aufhebung, transcendence or sublation. Okay, so his whole critical theory is aimed at precisely criticizing things in order to unpack and demystify them as they exist. That is to make them subject to examination, ask the questions, why are things the way they are? What are the internal contradictions they have? And in doing so, to serve as a guide to action, that is to shape practice, right? As he says in the famous 11th thesis of Feuerbach, philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. However, the crucial point is, again, that human beings cannot change the world willy-nilly, right? As he says in the opening of the 18th Brumaire, men make their own history, but not as they please, not as they please. So that is, human beings are always obviously acting on the world. They have the capacity to change the world, but only under conditions that they inherit, only under historical conditions that they inherit. But those historical conditions, which they do not choose, also shape the ways in which people think, right? As he says further down in the same passage on 18 Brumaire, traditions of the dead generations hang around the brains of the living like a nightmare, right? So traditions of dead generations. So we are in some sense encumbered in our very modes of thought by history. So history fundamentally shapes our social institutions, our relations, and our modes of thought. But nonetheless, through a critique of this history, of social institutions and our modes of thought, our systems of relations, through a critique of that, we can see what the contradictions are, and those contradictions might reveal the way in which we can move on to something better, that we can transform the world and improve the conditions and eliminate the difficulties and contradictions in them. So that's why he's doing a critique. He wants to, in a really ambitious way, realize the possibilities for genuine human freedom. Now, this brings us to the notion of Marx's notion, concerned with Marx's notion of human nature. Marx does not have a static understanding of human nature. He's not a social contract theorist. We've encountered three major paradigms of the social contract tradition: Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. All of them begin with a sketch of human nature as they are, the original condition of man. And from that, they derive a set of arguments for why society and state and government and politics are necessary, right? Marx doesn't give you, Marx is not in the tradition. A lot has transpired in the 100 years since Rousseau. We're not reaching many of the major other interventions, intellectual interventions. If we had time, we would have read Kant and Hegel, maybe even Hume. And then it would have made more sense. Maybe Marx would have made more sense to all of us. Unfortunately, for shortness of time, we cannot do that. So again, I'll be schematic in my reconstruction. Marx doesn't have a static conception of human nature. Right. In fact, at one point he says in a pamphlet he wrote called "The Poverty of Philosophy," all history is a transformation of human nature. All of history is simply a transformation of human nature. That is, human nature is characterized fundamentally by potentiality. That human nature is something that can change, and has that internal potentiality. However, if I could give a schematic account again, I believe that Marx, there are two key dimensions to Marx's account of human nature. One is that human beings have the capacity to consciously act and cooperate with each other. Okay, this again is distinctively humans. I mean, otters can do that to some extent. Many animals can do that when they're hunting in packs, let's say. But in a very concerted way, in a very conscious way, human beings have a unique ability to cooperate with each other and create the world in which they live. Right. They don't do it all the time, but there are flashes of this throughout human history. This is partly because human beings are the only species that are able to distinctively understand themselves as part of a human species, right? That they understand themselves to be part of a broader community of humanity, right? This brings us to the second important dimension, that human beings have potentiality in that they are the ones who create a world, a uniquely human world out of the natural world. Okay, so in doing this, human beings act on nature, and in the process of collectively creating a human world out of nature, we're able to not only transform the world in which we live, but also transform ourselves. We develop new capacities and we develop new needs. Okay, so all of history is simply this process of the collective creation of humanity, right? So we are, and we are not only acting on nature and our physical surroundings. In doing so, we're always already creating invisible webs of human relationships. We are also creating social institutions and political institutions. No animal can do this, right? So the point, however, and this is what brings us to Marx's concern, is that up until now, up until the present, when he's writing 19th century, human beings have done so only in the conditions of domination, conflict, and human unfreedom, right? That the world we have created up till until now, it's obviously a creation of humanity, collective creation of humanity, but we've done it without conscious cooperation with each other and without genuine human freedom and will. Okay, so this should remind you of that famous opening line of the social contract: man is born free, but is everywhere in chains, right? That we have always been in chains up until now. We have always created a human world. We have developed new capacities. We have developed new needs, but have done so in the context of domination and conflict, right? But the challenge is, how might we be able to do it in the context of freedom and cooperation and rational creativity? This, Marx claims, can only be the result of history. And to go through history is a grueling process. Right? So because in going through history, we're constantly trying to transform not only the world we live, but also our own capacities. Just think about our productive capacity, the things that human beings can do. Look at the world around you, right? Human beings are today able to go into space. Right? This is a historical achievement. If you don't want to focus only on productive capacities, think about something as essential as language. Homo sapiens have been around for 13,000 years. Probably they had rudimentary forms of linguistic communication for most of that period, but human literacy, the ability to read and write, only begins 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And for the most part, since then, literacy was only possessed by some groups of people, right? Minuscule groups of people: priests, religious clergy, major thinkers, and the rest. For the most part, most humans were illiterate. Today, literacy is a universal, almost universal reality, right? Almost every human being on earth is literate. This is, again, is a historical achievement. But once you become literate, once you learn the ability to read and write, it changes your capacity to do things. A whole new horizon of things opens up for you. The same can be said about things like algebra, the things like chemistry, science, physics. All these intellectual developments themselves transform human capacities and abilities, and they create new kinds of needs, new frameworks of social relationships, new institutions, in a whole new reality, right? But Marx will claim that so far, all these great developments that have happened throughout most of human history have happened under conditions not of complete human freedom. Okay, it has happened mostly in the conditions of domination and heteronomy. Before I come to this issue of domination and heteronomy, let me just clarify one thing about Marx's conception of history. Right, Marx, you will perhaps have heard, is a materialist. In fact, the orientation, his methodological or philosophical orientation, was often later called by Engels and other Marxists as dialectical materialism. It's important to understand in what sense Marx is a materialist, right? Marx does not think that we are materialists in the sense that we're simply a creation, that human beings are simply matter, right? That we're simply affected by the material world. One of the major thinkers that Marx is actually debating with in his critique of the philosophy of Hegel is Feuerbach. And Feuerbach is attributed the famous phrase, "You are what you eat," right? You're what you eat, in the sense that you are simply shaped by the material world that constructs you. Marx's claim is that you are what you do, right? You are that human beings are characterized by what they do, that the fact that they create social relations, that they are able to act on nature and create a human world out of it, is what makes you human. And that is the sense in which he's a materialist. He wants to understand how human beings are creating social relations, social institutions, and a whole material world in which they live and coexist, right? So that is the sense, that is the depth of his materialism. Now, let's return to this issue of domination and unfreedom. Marx believes that for most of human history, we have lived under conditions of domination and unfreedom, right? Now, it's important to unpack and try to analyze what this word domination means. Domination can be understood in many ways. Last time with Rousseau, I already implied a distinction between freedom, thinking about freedom in two different ways, drawing on Isaiah Berlin between negative and positive freedom. And the reformulation I offered was freedom and autonomy. Freedom is a certain kind of protection from harm, right? That your rights are protected and the rest. Autonomy means that you are actually the author of the rules according to which you live, right? So Marx wants to, in the Rousseauian fashion, argue for autonomy, that is genuine human autonomy, that we are collectively determine the conditions of our life. Okay. Now, he claims that for most of human history, we've not been able to do this. We've not done this in the framework of social relations, which actually allow for conscious cooperation and free human will, right? Now, why does he believe this? He doesn't mean that we have always been dominated by individuals above us, that there has always been inequality. That is certainly true. There always has been inequality. Some have been masters, some have been serfs, some have been servants, some have been kings, some have been subjects. So there's always domination. There's always somebody ruling over others, right? But that is what you can call a personified domination, right? The depth of Marx's critique is to show the ways in which human creations, human social relations, human institutions, although are the results of human activity, nonetheless come to have dominating and controlling power over us. And this is the notion of heteronomy. That is, you're not in the grip of, you're not under the thumb of individuals. You're not under the thumb of somebody who's your boss or your political leader. You're oftentimes in the grip of impersonal social forces, right? Social relations which come to employ their force on you, right? You are subject to the rules of the market, for example. Although the market is something that you create, that human beings create through their own actions, right? You're subject to the rules of the state, but clearly the state is something that is a creation of human action. Things like religion. Religion, again, and this is something we'll encounter in the first critique of Hegel's philosophy, right? That religion is something that human beings create, but nonetheless, religions come to somehow dominate and control us. Religion tells human beings how to live, right? The 10 Commandments, for example. So Marx believes that for most of human history, we have always remained in framework of relations where people act and create the world, but the world and that they create, the institutions they create, the relationships that they create, themselves become a certain kind of dominating force over them. This brings us to the important notion of alienation. This is a central concept, and I would claim that this is a concept that lives through all of Marx's work, right? So again, continuing with this account of history, human beings are dominated by their own creations. This is the paradox that Marx is dealing with. And this is why he calls it alienation, in the sense that the things that we create, religion, institutions, state, government, law, politics, economy, right, commercial society, and the rest, all of these strike us as something alien, as something already given, right? As something that is obvious and natural. The things like property are natural. Right? So the moment when things that are obviously the historical creations of human beings strike us as something natural, as already given, means that we have lost the ability, we have lost the recognition that these are creations and artificial works of human beings. No. So whenever you see the world around you and you just take it for granted as it is things are how they are, you've forgotten that things were created that way. Okay. Whenever you raise, I'm sure you have encountered this dialogue at some point. You might say something, oh, things must change. And somebody says to you, well, this is just how things are, right? That's the claim that Marx is making. Whenever we say that, that's just how things are, we are accepting, we're becoming alienated from the very world that we have created ourselves. We have failed to recognize that the world in front of us is a human creation. And since it is a human creation, then it simply makes no sense to say that things cannot change, right? So the whole point the whole ambition of Marxist thought is to make human beings aware, right? Establish the conditions so that the world that we create, we know that we are doing so consciously, and we are doing so in cooperation with each other, not competing with each other, and we're doing it with our own rational, creative will. Okay, so that's what it means to have genuine human freedom. As long as we're not able to do that, as long as we're not able to do that, as long as we live under conditions of necessity, scarcity, disease, as long as we are living in social relations which involve domination, conflict, competition, inequality, heteronomy, then we have not really begun to live as human beings. Okay. So the whole point of critique, and there is a famous sentence in the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which we will read tomorrow. He says, capitalist society, which is the modern society in which he lives, and the society in which I would say we also live, he says it is the last stage of human prehistory. Last stage of human prehistory. It means that we have not really started to live like human beings. We have not started to live under conditions and relations, human relations, where we recognize that the world we create is our own creation. And we're doing so in conscious cooperation and with rational creative will, right? So up until now, as in now for him, is society where there is liberal constitutional states and a capitalist economy. This is the condition in which we are. And Marx's point is that this is a very powerful, obviously, a great achievement, again, of human history. We're obviously living in a society where there's immense production, right? We have, in some ways, overcome scarcity. But this is also a system where more and more human beings are pawns of an impersonal system, right? They've become human beings have more and more become cogs in a machine, right? There's greater inequality, and there's also in many ways greater discontent, right? So Marx his whole political philosophy and his later works are aimed at a critique of this present structure of society in order to open up the possibility for ways in which the difficulties, the contradictions, the limitations of this particular arrangement, historically specific arrangement, can be overcome, and that we can lead to something genuinely human and free. He calls this, in the Jewish Question, human emancipation, and by the time he's writing the manifesto, he calls it communism. So we'll now try to enter into the text, but before that, I have to say a few words about the relationship of another major thinker, probably the most important philosopher of the modern world, Hegel, and Marx. But this again is tricky to do because we haven't really read Hegel. So again, I'll be overly schematic and brief. Now, in these early works, Marx is actually coming out of the spell of Hegel. Unfortunately, we're not reading Hegel, as I said, but it's kind of unavoidable to talk about him because in many ways, Marx's early works, his early writings are not only shaped by Hegel's philosophy, but in a way directly responding to it. So there has to be some confrontation with Hegel in this lecture. For the most part, intellectually, I think there are two major concepts that Marx draws on, borrows, and that actually shapes his thinking from Hegel. And these are the notions of totality and dialectic. Now, what do these mean? Now, totality for Hegel, it means that any society, historical epoch, or system of thought needs to be understood as an integrated whole, right? That you cannot simply examine some parts of it. One has to actually look at and see how the logic of something fits together and how everything is held together. Okay. History itself, for Hegel, is a kind of meaningful integrated whole. Now, history might seem on the surface to be simply a sequence of accidents, gruesome events, and conflicts. But if one tries to examine the logic of it, that there is in fact a necessary logic to the historical movement, and all of it, Hegel claims, is geared towards the realization of human freedom, which involves the rational mastery over the world and achieving a certain kind of self-consciousness. Okay, but this process, this long-term historical process, is a dialectical process. And this has three dimensions. First is the insistence that nothing in the world is static, that everything is always in the process of developing or becoming. Second, that the transformations that happen, the developments that happen, don't happen in a particular system because of external shocks, but because of built-in contradictions and tensions, right? Built-in contradictions, which actually create objective possibilities for the transcendence. That is, again, the notion of Hebung, the movement onto something better by observing what is good and getting rid of the contradictions and tensions. So Hegel produces this whole history of philosophy, right? Which is aimed at trying to understand the stages of philosophical thought. And at each stage, he claims that something has been produced that is correct, but still radically incomplete. And the whole historical movement and this whole development of philosophical thought is shaped by, it's a famous notion called the cunning of reason, or the ruse of reason, that if you look under the surface of these developments, which seem, again, accidental and don't really seem coherent in any ways, if you look under the surface, what you realize is this: all of this is tied together and is contributing to and is part of a logic of development of society, which is not in any means intended by anyone, but that is the underlying logic, and that it comes to fruition and arrives at human self-consciousness and human freedom. Okay, so Marx is using this whole Hegelian frame, but instead of trying to talk about simply systems of philosophical thought, he wants to bring this to bear on human social relationships as a whole, right? So he wants to apply it to social formations and view them as integrated wholes, where the economic structure is connected to politics, philosophy, art, and the rest, right? So every system, every historical epoch has a specific social system which has within it certain contradictions that create not only tensions, but also objective possibilities for transcending those tensions. So modern society is obviously a result of history in this view. It has a logical necessity, but at the same time, it contains within it the seeds of its own destruction and overcoming by a higher stage of society. Okay, so Marx is breaking with Hegel by producing what I've already discussed, a kind of materialistic dialectic, right? For Hegel, the motor of history, again, these are not things that you really should you should concern yourself with about. We'll come to the text, but I think this will illustrate what Marx is trying to do. For Hegel, the motor of history is spirit, a certain kind of self-consciousness that is striving for awareness of it, right? That is, it is mind, or the spirit is in some sense human reason that is trying to arrive at self-consciousness, becoming aware of itself. For Marx, Marx contends that, well, we cannot really understand human relationships and human development and human history from the point of view of ideas and philosophies. We have to look at it in terms of concrete individuals living in concrete social relations, which are ultimately rooted in the mode of production. Right? Mode of production, which, again, this is the materialist dimension, which in the most general sense, as I've already said, is the sort of collective relationship of humans to nature, out of which human beings acting on nature create a world of their own. Right? So the driving motor of history is this framework of social relations through which human beings act on the world. And in a genuinely human society, in a society where there is freedom, human beings will be able to create a rational world consciously, right? So consciousness will determine their social existence. This has not happened so far in human history. Okay. So that's the Hegelian influence in Marx. Now, there is also a more direct critique of Hegel, which we'll come to in a moment when we read the Jewish question. So Hegel is in a way trying to respond to the contributions of both Locke and another thinker, Adam Smith, who we haven't read, and also Rousseau. Okay, so he's trying to reconcile both of these, and the Lockean picture is not satisfactory, obviously, because in the Lockean system, what you have is civil society where there are individuals simply pursuing their private matters because they are only concerned with their own property, and as long as their property and their rights are protected, they will just go around engaging in their whole economic life, pursuing their self-interest, narrow self-interest, and there's no real sense of community. There's no real concern about community, right? And then comes Rousseau and talks about the general will and thinks about what it might mean to actually live again in conditions of human freedom. And Hegel adopts this, and he says, well, members of civil society, they live in a world as competitive individuals who are isolated. This is not really fulfillment of freedom. the solution is that human beings become part of a political community and a state, right? And you produce the laws by which you freely obey, to use the Rousseauian notion, and you obey the laws because you're a member of the political community and you authorize the rules of its own existence. And so these laws are binding on you, right? So you're able to transcend, again, move on from this civil society where you're competing with each other as individuals, and you become members of a broader community, and that is contained in the spirit of citizenship, right? So in a modern world, again, this is the context in which Marx is writing, right? The modern regime is characterized by liberal constitutional republics and the birth of a commercial capitalist society. In this modern world, we need community that is broader than just your narrow self-interest, your family, and the rest, right? So the modern state is what promises this community for Hegel. Okay. Now Marx also recognizes this problem, but he says that this is not really that becoming members of political community is not sufficient. So that is what is going to be the argument. And in order to draw out this argument, he's going to begin first with the critique of religion, and then he's going to go into a critique of the state itself. So let's see how he systematically builds the argument. We're going to read some passages, and these are, again, complex passages, very famous passages. So we'll try to be as consistent as possible. So first, beginning with the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the introduction, we're only reading the first 2 pages, and then we'll show why this becomes relevant to his critique of the argument on the Jewish question. Okay. So he begins this famous work, with the claim, for Germany, the criticism of religion has largely been completed. So for Germany, he's talking about the young Hegelian intellectual movement. These are followers of Hegel who have, again, realized that Hegel in some ways remains incomplete. So they want to complete that project. And they claim that the way in which you're able to really complete the intellectual project of Hegel and achieve human self-consciousness is by critiquing religion, showing why religion is somehow illusory. Okay. So he says, in Germany, within the intellectual atmosphere he is in, the criticism of religion has largely been completed, which means that it is not yet complete. And he says, the criticism of religion is the premise of all criticism. So if you want to really examine and critique social reality as it exists, any kind of social system, then you have to begin with the critique of religion, because religion, in some sense, contains aspirations of how humans should be, right? How human community really should be. Okay. So he says, the basis of irreligious criticism is this. Okay, so this is what the German young Hegelians have so far achieved. This is their critique. Man makes religion. Religion does not make man. Religion is indeed man's self-consciousness and self-awareness, so long as he has not found himself or has lost himself again. Okay, so this is the basis of the religious criticism out of the young Hegelians in Germany. And they have realized that religion is, in some sense, a certain kind of confusion, because human beings are the ones who create religion, right? Human beings are the ones who create. God is a construct of the human mind, right? And he says, but man is not an abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the human world, the state, the society. This state, this society produce religion, which is an inverted world consciousness, because they are an inverted world. It is an inverted world consciousness. It is inverted precisely in the sense that human beings fail to recognize that God and religion are itself constructions and creations of humans. Okay, so we create God. It's a construct of our human mind. We produce religion, and then we claim that, as the first book of Genesis claims, that we are created in the image of God. So this is inverted world consciousness, right? Something that we have created, we attribute to it alien powers and ability to, in fact, create us in its own image, right? That is the inversion. So Marx says that this is, so far in Germany, this has been the critique of religion, and this is really quite a powerful and compelling critique. But it is not yet complete. It is not yet complete. Why? Religion is the general theory of this world. Its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, its general basis of consolation and justification. So religion serves this kind of function. It gives you an idealized picture of how society can be, what human potentiality can be like. Right? And then he says, it is the fantastic realization of the human being in as much as the human being possesses no true reality. It is the fantastic realization of human being. Why? Because it tries to locate actualization of the human spirit only after death, only out of this world. It is only in heaven that you get to live in a way, in a true utopian world, right? In the real world, you're always in sin. So you're denied any kind of realization of the human. And Marx says that actually this says something compelling about human social reality, because it says that in our world as we exist today, we live under conditions of heteronomy, domination, antagonism, conflict. Right? The struggle against religion, therefore, indirectly is a struggle against the world. His spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is at the same time an expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Now, why is this? Because again, religion, if you go back to the Bible, I'm referring to the Bible because I assume that most of you are familiar with it in the West. If you go back to the Bible and you listen to the Sermon on the Mount, it contains a certain aspiration of how human beings should live like. Okay, so religion in some ways contains this aspiration for what genuinely human community would look like. Okay, so religion for Marx has this element of alienation. Why? Because we both, it is an illusory worldview, right, generated by reality, that we human beings live in an actually alienated world. So for Marx, religion is not only an inverted world consciousness, it is an alienated world consciousness. It is an alienated world consciousness because we live in a world where we are ourselves alienated. And religion is simply a symbolic recognition and acceptance of our alienation. But as he says, it is the fantastic realization of the human being in as much as the human being possesses no true reality. It is also alienated in a different sense, in a deeper sense, because he's saying that in religion, human beings project, we alienate our own possibilities of fulfillment and for leading a genuinely human life onto an imaginary realm of heaven or outside of the actual social world, right? So religion contains, as I said already, referring to the Sermon on the Mount, the aspiration for living in a genuinely human community. Okay, so he says, continuing, and this is the famous sentence: religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of the heartless world, and the soul of a soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. Again, this has been misunderstood many, many times. His claim is not that religion is a kind of ideology that distracts people from confronting the fundamental problems around them. It is not something that confuses them. Religion is really a drug. It is a drug that allows us to cope with our real suffering in our real world, right? But it also contains this kind of protest against the real world. It's trying to claim that we must be able to live in different conditions, right? That the world we live in is not one that is in any ways fulfilling. However, it is alienating because it only is able to project, religion is only able to project the fulfillment of that kind of world onto a realm outside of the world, that is post-death, in the world of salvation, heaven, and the rest. So this is his critique of religion. But from this, he will say, once we make this critique of religion, we can now move on to a critique of politics. So he says, at the bottom of that page, on now 54, it is the task of history, therefore, once the other world of truth has vanished, that is this, the truth of this heaven and God and all of this has vanished, to establish the truth of this world. So once we have eliminated and critiqued religion, and recognizing that religion is an alienated world consciousness completes the critique, we're able to establish the truth of this world. The immediate task of philosophy, which is in the surface of history, is to unmask human self-alienation in its secular form, now that it has been unmasked in its sacred form. Now, where does alienation exist now in the secular form? And he will say that this exists in the domain of politics and law. Thus, the criticism of heaven is transformed into the criticism of earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of law, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics. Okay. So now that we have dealt with the problem of religion, which, as we saw, is not only an inverted world consciousness in that we fail to realize that which we have created is our own creation, and we attribute to it a whole range of powers that come to actually dominate and control us. But religion also contains a certain kind of protest against our real world suffering, that we exist really in a world where we are alienated, and hence we transfer our project our aspirations for human fulfillment into religion. Okay, but religion nonetheless is an opium in that sense. It only allows us to cope with our human self-alienation and our real suffering in a world where we live under frameworks of relationships that contain domination and heteronomy. Okay, but now he says we can move on to the critique of politics, and that's what he's trying to do on the Jewish question. And this is a piece that he wrote as a criticism of another young Hegelian named Bruno Bauer, and the title of the essay is On the Jewish Question. And the Jewish question is a question that comes up in Germany, and it's in a way representative of the minority question in any kind of political context. So in Germany, in the Prussian state, the question is, well, how can Jews become citizens? How can Jews become citizens in a state which is Christian? Okay, the state has an official religion, and Bruno Bauer's asking the question, well, how can Jews become part of this state? And the answer he arrives at is that both Jews have to abandon their religious identity and try to become citizens, and at the same time, the state itself has to declare itself emancipated from religion. That is, it has to become a secular state, right? So Bauer's criticism or Bauer's argument is that political emancipation or freedom for Jews would require both the establishment of a secular constitutional state, a state that does not have an official religion, but also the development and cultivation of a certain kind of citizenship, an identity of citizenship where Jews are able to no longer only view themselves as Jews, right? That they arrive at a kind of secular identity as citizens. Okay. Now, the criticism that Marx will make of Bauer's argument is to show that political freedom of this kind is not enough. That is, citizenship becoming universal is not enough. It is not something that actually gives you a sense of free community. Why? Because in civil society, as individuals, we still live in a world that is intensely grounded in domination and competition. Now, instead of focusing on the German case itself, Marx says, well, we don't really need to look at Germany itself. We can look at other countries around the world, other countries that have become secular, that is, they no longer have an official state religion. And then let's look at how religion works, right? So he says on page 31, the question is, what is the relationship between complete political emancipation and religion? Again, political emancipation here means that to become a citizen of a particular community, a political community, your religion does not matter, right? And not only is your religion relevant, in a way, political emancipation would mean that nothing else matters except the fact that you're a citizen, right? So it means universal citizenship. Okay, that's the meaning of political emancipation, becoming a citizen of a political community. So there's no rank or distinction. There's no rank or distinction in limiting who can be a citizen. Okay. So he says, what is the relationship between complete political emancipation and religion? If we find in the country which has attained full political emancipation that religion not only continues to exist, but is fresh and vigorous, this is proof that the existence of religion is not at all opposed to the perfection of the state. So his response to Bauer is, Bauer, let's look at the United States. The United States is, at this point, the American Revolution has happened. It is a secular state. It does not have an official religion. But if you just look at the society in America, people there still remain intensely religious, right? So there is no relationship between becoming a citizen and staying religious. But as we've seen from his critique of religion, that to be religious means that you are actually alienated around, you're actually alienated in your real world, right? Religion is both the protest and the sigh of a oppressed creature, right? It is both the protest and the sigh of it's the opium. So if in a country that is politically free, that has given universal citizenship and does not discriminate based on the religion, based on anybody's religion, then the fact that people in that society are still remain religious, but not only do they remain religious, in a way religion is vigorous, right? It says it remains fresh and vigorous. It means that people there still remain, that they're still relying on the opium. They still are actually alienated and living under conditions of oppression and domination. So he says, this is proof that the existence of religion is not at all opposed to the perfection of the state. But since the existence of religion is the existence of a defect, this is the defect, real-world alienation, the source of this defect must be sought in the nature of the state itself. And then he continues, we do not claim that they must transcend their religious narrowness. So he's talking about, Jews need not transcend their religious narrowness. That is, they don't need to abandon their Judaism in order to get rid of secular limitations. In order to become citizens, they don't really need to abandon Judaism. We claim that they will transcend their religious narrowness once they have overcome their secular limitations. That is, only once they're able to overcome the limits of political freedom will they be able to actually overcome their religious, their religion, right? Because the narrowness or the limitations of the secular state are really the real foundations for human oppression and violence. That is what creates an alienated world. We do not turn secular questions into theological questions. We turn theological questions into secular ones. History has for long been resolved into superstition, but we now resolve superstition into history. The question of the relation between political emancipation and religion becomes for us a question of relation between political emancipation and human emancipation, right? So political emancipation is not enough. In fact, this becomes the basis of all critiques of law, in a way, in the radical democratic tradition. What he's trying to say is that mere citizenship, legal and formal equality of all is not enough. Why? Just take an analog of this in the modern contemporary American world. If you abolish slavery, the 13, 14, 15 amendments after the Civil War, let's say, does that actually abolish racism? If you arrive at civil rights movements, right, you establish formal legal equality of all. You do not discriminate on the basis of race legally and politically. Then does that abolish racism? The same can be asked about gender equality. If you give women the right to vote, right, does that abolish patriarchy? Does that actually transform patriarchy? If you give homosexuals and gays the right to marriage, does that eliminate and eradicate homophobia? No. So this is the kind of critique he's making. He's saying that just because you give universal citizenship to everybody, and with the United States, his argument is most principally concerned religion. Again, he's using this simply as a marker, as an indexical. His deeper point is about law and the relationship of citizenship to actual human freedom. He says, even if you abolish, let's say, something like private property, okay, and this is what Locke wants, right? Locke wants to guarantee everybody the right to private property. So you can become a member of a state and the state will not discriminate based on whether or not you have a property. You're going to be a citizen. You're going to be a citizen, and everyone will, and you will have the natural right. So property becomes something that is part of the natural world, that becomes part of civil society. Right? And Marx's claim is that actually this is what will allow for greater inequality to persist, because you are invisibilizing these distinctions and ranks which are social from the domain of politics. Okay, so all these ranks and distinctions, race, class, gender, etc., religion, if you establish political equality, it does not eliminate it from society itself. Okay, so political freedom and political emancipation certainly is a step in the right direction. This is what Marx claims. It's definitely a historical achievement. It's a progressive step, but it is not enough, because all these ranks and distinctions are ultimately social. Their secret lies in civil society. And in civil society, as long as they continue to exist, as long as they are not, they will not allow for genuine human emancipation. What you will have is only political emancipation, and that is not enough. So, and now comes the major and very important passage. This is the bottom of page 33. The perfected political state, again, a state that has achieved full political emancipation. It gives universal citizenship to every one of its members. It does not discriminate based on any ranks, distinctions, and qualifications. Okay, so this would be the modern United States, let's say. Okay, everybody can be a citizen. If you're born a citizen, everybody has the same rights. It does not technically discriminate. Obviously, we know there are complexities, but in principle, it does not discriminate based on law itself, right? Amongst any of its citizens. If you're a citizen, you have the right to vote. If you have certain duties, but your natural rights are mostly protected by law, right? So the perfected political state is by its nature the species life of man as opposed to his material life. Okay, so this is what Hegel calls a political community, right? You're a member of a community when you're a member of a state. But this is, Marx says, in opposition to his real material life in civil society. All the presuppositions of this egoistic life continue to exist in civil society outside the political sphere as qualities of civil society. Where the political state has attained to its full development, man leads not only in thought, in consciousness, but in reality, in life, a double existence, celestial and terrestrial, a double existence. What does this mean? Again, let's think about it concretely. You and your boss both go to the same church. You listen to the same sermons, you feel the same way about your religious and spiritual, you have a similar religious spiritual experience. Then you go out and you vote. You're both citizens, you have the same, your vote counts the same, but you return to work and your boss commands over you, right? Your boss tells you what to do. Or you and your friend, you might also go to the same church, you might listen to the same sermons, you'll have the same spiritual experience, you're the same citizens, but for the job, you will compete against each other. So in civil society, it's a dog-eat-dog world. You compete with each other. There are some people who rule over others, who dominate others, but political community gives you this illusion that you're all members of an equal community, right? You have just the same vote. But you're not Jeff Bezos. You're not Bill Gates. You're not Elon Musk, right? So his point is that in civil society, that is where we live as private individuals, where we have to make our ends meet, where we have to find job, find education, have a career, earn money in order to have a living. In that life, we act as animals. We act as narrowly private individuals who compete with each other, and there's no sense of community and cooperation. Okay, so we live a double existence. As members of a political community, we have the same vote, we are the same citizen. We can think of ourselves as Americans or whatever nation we belong to. But in private life, we live as competitive individuals. Okay, so he says, he lives in political community where he regards himself as a communal being, and in civil society where he acts simply as a private individual, treats other men as means, degrades himself to the role of mere means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. So that is our real condition of life. That is the alienated condition of life, because of which we need religion, right? Because of which we need religion. And the state, the perfected political state, a state based on universal citizenship, a liberal constitutional republic in its ideal form, is not sufficient, because it actually gives us a split existence where we, in private lives, live as beasts who compete with each other. It's a Hobbesian state of war of all against all, right? So the political state in the relation to civil society is just as the spiritual as is heaven in relation to earth. It stands in the same opposition to civil society and overcomes it in the same manner as religion overcomes the narrowness of profane world. Okay, man in his most intimate reality in civil society is a profane being. Here, where he appears both to himself and to others as a real individual, he's an illusory phenomenon. So as a real concrete individual, you simply do not live as authentic human beings. Okay, this is again a Rousseauian picture, if you remember, of the nature of man as it's transformed by society. Now, this leads him to conclude that there is a necessity for a certain kind of social revolution, that only at the level of society, once you transform and attack these structures and relations of domination and inequality and competition, only then can you actually arrive at genuinely human freedom. A political revolution that establishes universal citizenship is not enough. So he says, this is towards the end of the assigned reading, page 46, the political revolution dissolves civil society into its elements without revolutionizing these elements themselves or subjecting them to criticism. This revolution regards civil society, the sphere of human needs, labor, private interest, and civil law, as the basis of its own existence, as a self-subsistent precondition, and thus as its natural basis. Again, think about it. He's saying that the Lockean vision of the natural world is what the state actually requires. It presupposes that. Finally, man as a member of civil society is identified with authentic man. Man is distinct from citizen because he is a man in the sensuous, individual, immediate existence, whereas political man is only abstract, artificial man. Man is allegorical, moral person. Okay. Thus, man as he really is seen only in the form of egoistic man. So the real conditions of human beings, as humans, as private individuals, are egoistic human beings. And man in his true nature only as abstract citizen. Right? So citizenship becomes this abstract ideal, which we don't actually really live. In society, we live as narrow private individuals. For the most part, we compete with each other for jobs. We compete with each other for education. We think of other human beings as means, as things we can use as instruments for the improvement of our own life. We seldom have real experiences of fundamental solidarity and community with others. So he concludes, every emancipation is the restoration of the human world and the human emancipation to man himself. Political emancipation is a reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of civil society, an independent and egoistic individual, and on the other hand, to a citizen, to a moral person. Human emancipation will only be complete when the real individual man has absorbed into himself the abstract citizen, when as an individual man in his everyday life, in his work and in his relationship, he has become a species being. And when he has recognized and organized his own powers as social powers, so that he can no longer separate the social power from himself as political power. Okay, so it means this is the account of human freedom that Marx is trying to furnish. It's not similar to a Rousseauian general will, but it's based on shaping our modes of life, our very modes of life, the ways in which we engage in economic life, in our social, intimate social relationships, in our forms of local community and the rest. Everything must involve this spirit of citizenship. You have to integrate that spirit of citizenship in the domain of civil society, not simply at the domain of politics and the state. You have to become a species being, that is, recognize yourself as part of a human species, as part of a larger community, and then recognize that together, cooperatively, you have the social powers to create the world, which again does not strike you as an irresistible alien force that has control over you, against which you are simply an individual trying to make your way. Okay, so that's what he calls human emancipation here. Within a few years, as he's writing the Communist Manifesto, which we'll read tomorrow, he will call this communism and socialism, and we'll see what his radical critique of the capitalist society or modern society is in that text.